For 46 years, the Islamic Republic operated on a single unbreakable principle. The supreme leader's authority was absolute, the Revolutionary Guard's loyalty was unquestionable, and the architecture of clerical rule was permanent. Three pillars holding up a structure that survived 8 years of war with Iraq, 4 decades of American sanctions, the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, the nuclear program crisis, and every internal protest movement from the Green Revolution to Masa Amini. The system did not bend. The system did not break. The system absorbed every shock and emerged with its core architecture intact. That system just collapsed from within, not from American bombs, not from Israeli strikes, not from street protests, from inside the IRGC itself. Read those words carefully because the implications have not yet registered in Washington, in Tel Aviv, in Riyadh, or in any of the foreign ministries currently scrambling to understand what they are looking at. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the Praetorian Guard that has protected the regime since 1979, the organization whose entire institutional purpose is the preservation of clerical rule, has begun executing a sequence of operational moves that no analyst predicted, no intelligence agency anticipated, and no diplomatic apparatus prepared for. What happened over the past 72 hours inside the IRGC's central command structure represents the single most consequential development in Iranian internal politics since the death of Ayatollah Khomeini. And the most disturbing element is not what occurred. It is who allowed it to occur and why they chose this specific moment after decades of opportunities to act differently. The American intelligence community received the first signal at approximately 3:14 in the morning Tehran time, a communications intercept that initially appeared to be standard military coordination chatter. Within 4 hours, that assessment was revised catastrophically. By the time the president's daily brief was finalized, the language had shifted from monitoring to active crisis tracking. By midday in Washington, every Middle East desk and every relevant agency had been pulled into emergency session. What they were looking at violated every assumption that had structured American Iran policy for 2 decades. Stay with this analysis carefully, because what comes next requires understanding not just what happened, but why every previous framework for predicting Iranian behavior just became obsolete in a single afternoon. To understand why this moment is so historically shattering, the foundation must be properly laid. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps was not designed as a conventional military organization. Its founding charter in May 1979 established it as the ideological enforcement arm of the revolution, an apparatus distinct from the regular Iranian armed forces specifically because the new regime did not trust the institutional military it had inherited from the Shah. Over 46 years, that apparatus grew into something unprecedented in the modern world. The IRGC commands approximately 190,000 active personnel across ground forces, Navy, aerospace, and the elite Quds Force. It controls Iran's ballistic missile program, its drone production infrastructure, its cyber warfare capabilities, and its proxy networks spanning Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Yemen, and Gaza. More critically, the IRGC controls an economic empire estimated by various Western intelligence assessments to encompass between 20 and 40% of Iran's total GDP through opaque holding companies, construction conglomerates, telecommunications firms, and shadow banking networks that operate beyond civilian oversight. This is the central fact that almost every Western analysis of Iran has missed for the past decade. The IRGC is not a military organization that happens to have economic interests. It is an economic empire that happens to have military capabilities. And the men who command its various directorates are not soldiers in any conventional sense. They are oligarchs in uniform, controlling fortunes that rival anything held by the original revolutionary clerics. Hossein Salami commands the entire organization as chief commander. Beneath him, Mohammad Reza Naqvi runs coordination affairs. Ismail Khani directs the Quds Force after inheriting that position from Soleimani in January 2020. Amir Ali Hajizadeh commands the aerospace force responsible for the missile and drone arsenals. Each of these men sits atop personal networks of patronage, business interests, and operational loyalty that have grown thicker and more independent with every passing year. The supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, is 86 years old. He has been in power since 1989. His health has been the subject of speculation in foreign intelligence assessments since at least 2014, when the first credible reports of prostate cancer surgery emerged through Israeli channels. The succession question has hung over the entire Iranian system for more than a decade, with 2 candidates receiving sustained internal attention. His son, Mojtaba Khamenei, has been positioned as a potential heir, despite the obvious dynastic implications that contradict revolutionary ideology. Former President Ebrahim Raisi was the alternative candidate until his death in the May 2024 helicopter crash that intelligence analysts in 3 Western capitals continue to consider operationally suspicious. Here is what almost nobody outside Tehran's innermost circles has understood about the succession architecture. The decision was never going to be made by the assembly of experts in any meaningful sense. The constitutional process exists as theater. The actual decision was always going to be made by whoever controlled the IRGC at the moment of transition. Because whoever controls the IRGC controls the apparatus that enforces the decision. And the men commanding that apparatus have been quietly preparing for that moment for years. But here is what nobody in Washington anticipated about the trap that just sprang. The IRGC is not preparing for succession. It is preparing for replacement. The mechanism that produced this catastrophic shift began with a sequence of decisions that appeared unrelated when they occurred individually. In late 2024, the Quds Force quietly accelerated its consolidation of control over Iraqi militia networks following the weakening of Hezbollah in Lebanon. The Aerospace Command initiated a complete inventory audit of the ballistic missile arsenal in early 2025, a procedure that had not been conducted at that depth since 2017. The Cyber Directorate expanded its domestic surveillance capabilities under the pretext of counterintelligence operations against Israeli infiltration. Now look at what this means across every theater where Iranian power projects simultaneously, because the scope of what is unfolding extends far beyond Tehran's internal politics. Each individual move was reported in fragments across various intelligence channels. None of them generated alarm because each could be explained by conventional rationales. The Iraqi consolidation appeared to be reinforcement following Hezbollah's degradation. The missile audit appeared to be standard military housekeeping. The cyber expansion appeared to be reasonable defensive posture, given the documented Israeli operations targeting Iranian infrastructure throughout 2024. What the analysts missed was the pattern. What every individual move actually represented was preparation. The Quds Force was securing external proxy loyalty independent of the central command structure. The aerospace audit was identifying which weapons could be reliably commanded by which specific officers. The Cyber Directorate was building the surveillance architecture necessary to monitor and neutralize potential opposition within the regime itself. By March 2026, the apparatus was operationally ready. What remained was the trigger. The trigger came in the form of a sequence of meetings that took place in a complex outside Tehran during the third week of April. The participants were not the senior IRGC commanders, whose names appear in Western intelligence assessments. They were the second-tier officers, the colonels and brigadier generals who actually run daily operations across the various directorates, the men who control the trigger pullers, the missile crews, the cyber operators, and the proxy liaisons. The agenda of those meetings has been reconstructed through fragmentary intelligence flowing into Western capitals over the past week. The reconstruction is incomplete, and the conclusions remain provisional. But the picture that emerges is devastating in its implications. The second-tier IRGC command structure has reached an internal consensus that the existing political architecture of the Islamic Republic is no longer compatible with the organization's institutional survival. This is the calculation that changes everything. The IRGC is not concluding that the supreme leader must be replaced. It is concluding that the entire framework of clerical rule has become a strategic liability that must be restructured fundamentally. The arithmetic that produced this conclusion is not ideological. It is operational. After 46 years of clerical leadership, the IRGC's senior officers have determined that the system can no longer protect the apparatus they have built. The economic empire that constitutes the actual core of IRGC power cannot survive another decade of sanctions enforced by an increasingly sophisticated American Treasury Department. The proxy network cannot survive another decade of Israeli precision targeting. The missile arsenal cannot survive the technological gap that opens wider every year between Iranian capabilities and the integrated air defense systems being deployed across the region. The regime that the IRGC was designed to protect has become the obstacle preventing the IRGC from making the strategic adjustments necessary for its own survival. And so the apparatus has begun moving against the architecture it was built to defend. The first visible signal came when 3 senior clerical figures associated with the hardline faction were quietly placed under what intelligence analysts are now describing as protective custody, but which functions operationally as house arrest. The official explanation cited security concerns following alleged Israeli assassination plots. The actual mechanism was the removal of the clerical voices most likely to mobilize religious authority against IRGC restructuring. The second signal came through personnel changes within the Supreme Leader's own security detail. Officers loyal to specific Quds Force factions began appearing in positions that had previously been controlled by the Khamenei family's personal network. The transitions were presented as routine rotations. They were not routine. They were the systematic isolation of the Supreme Leader from the security apparatus that protected him from the IRGC itself. The third signal, and the one that finally broke through American intelligence analysis, came when the Aerospace Command issued new operational protocols requiring direct authentication from specific named officers before any missile or drone deployment could be executed. The new protocols effectively transferred launch authority from the Central Command to a small group of second-tier officers whose loyalty was to each other rather than to the formal chain of command. The trap was complete. The Supreme Leader retained his title. The constitutional architecture remained formally intact. The Assembly of Experts continued to exist, but the actual operational machinery of Iranian power had been quietly transferred to a new center of gravity that owed nothing to the clerical establishment. But this is where the situation becomes genuinely uncontrollable, because the apparatus that just executed this internal coup is not unified. The IRGC is fracturing along lines that nobody outside the organization fully understands. Ismail Qani's Quds Force has built its power base externally through the proxy networks and possesses the ideological conviction necessary to attempt a true Islamic restructuring rather than a secular pivot. Hajizade's Aerospace Command has built its power through technical capability and represents a more pragmatic faction willing to consider negotiated arrangements with Western powers in exchange for sanctions relief and technology transfer. Salami sits between these factions, formally commanding both but actually controlling neither. His position depends entirely on his ability to manage the competing agendas of officers who increasingly view his coordination as obstacle rather than leadership. The men who matter inside the apparatus are not coordinating with him. They are coordinating around him. President Masoud Pezeshkian, elected in 2024 on a reformist platform, has discovered that the IRGC restructuring has created an opening that no Iranian president has possessed since the early 1980s. His allies in the parliament have begun introducing legislation that would have been unthinkable 6 months ago, including measures that would subject IRGC economic holdings to genuine civilian oversight and proposals to restructure the relationship between the regular military and the revolutionary apparatus. Pezeshkian is operating on a calculation that the IRGC fracturing creates space for civilian authority to reassert itself. He may be correct. He may also be making a catastrophic miscalculation that ends in his removal or worse. The historical precedent suggests caution. Every Iranian president who has attempted to leverage IRGC internal divisions has discovered that the apparatus closes ranks against external civilian threats even when its internal divisions appear unresolvable. The clerical establishment is responding through channels that have not been activated in decades. Senior ayatollahs in Qom have begun issuing statements whose religious language conceals operational coordination against what they are describing as deviation from revolutionary principles. The Friday Prayer Network, dormant as a political instrument since the early 2000s, is being reactivated through coordinated messaging that emphasizes the supremacy of religious authority over military apparatus. Mojtaba Khamenei, the supreme leader's son, has begun appearing at meetings that his previous low profile would not have permitted. His emergence signals that the Khamenei family has recognized the threat and is mobilizing whatever institutional resources remain available to them. Whether those resources are sufficient remains the central unknowable variable in the entire equation. In Washington, the policy debate has fractured along predictable lines. The hawks, led by figures within the National Security Council who view this as the long-awaited collapse of the Islamic Republic, are advocating maximum pressure to accelerate the disintegration. The pragmatists, concentrated in the State Department and elements of the intelligence community, are warning that the IRGC restructuring may produce a regime that is more dangerous rather than less, a military oligarchy unconstrained by clerical ideological limits and willing to deploy capabilities that the existing system has held in reserve. Donald looked at the intelligence summary that morning and asked the question that nobody in the room had a confident answer for. Whether the United States benefits from the collapse of the clerical regime depends entirely on what replaces it. A military oligarchy with control over ballistic missiles, drone production, proxy networks, and approximately 40% of Iranian GDP is not obviously preferable to the existing arrangement. It may be substantially worse. In Jerusalem, the assessment is even more complicated. Benjamin's government has spent the past 3 years operating on the assumption that the existing clerical regime represents the maximum threat configuration that Iranian power can produce. That assumption may have been wrong. A restructured IRGC, unconstrained by clerical hesitation and operating with concentrated strategic decision-making authority, represents a qualitatively different category of adversary. The Israeli intelligence community is now running scenarios that had been considered too implausible to develop seriously. What does the Iranian threat look like when the apparatus that produces missiles and drones is no longer subordinated to a religious authority that occasionally restrains its deployment? What does the proxy network look like when the strategic patience of clerical leadership is replaced by the operational tempo of military command? What does the nuclear question look like when the men making the decisions are not balancing religious doctrine against national interest, but calculating purely from the perspective of institutional survival? In Riyadh, Mohammed bin Salman convened his Security Council for a meeting that lasted 7 hours. The Saudi assessment, according to fragmentary reporting reaching Western capitals, focused on the implications for the regional security architecture that has been carefully constructed through the Abraham Accords expansion and the normalization frameworks. A restructured Iran may not be interested in the diplomatic arrangements that the existing regime had begun, however reluctantly, to consider. But the most disturbing element of the entire crisis is not what is visible. It is what remains hidden. The American intelligence community's confidence in its assessment of internal IRGC dynamics has collapsed catastrophically over the past 2 weeks. Sources that had provided reliable reporting for years have gone silent. Communications intercepts that previously flowed steadily have been replaced by encrypted channels that have not yet been broken. The signals intelligence apparatus that had mapped IRGC command structures with growing precision is now confronting a target that has restructured itself faster than the mapping can be updated. This intelligence blindness is the most dangerous variable in the entire equation. The United States is now making policy decisions about an Iranian crisis whose central dynamics it cannot reliably observe. Every previous Iranian crisis has been managed through frameworks that assumed reasonable visibility into Tehran's internal deliberations. That assumption no longer holds. The The men who matter are operating in spaces that American intelligence cannot see, making decisions that American intelligence cannot anticipate, and preparing actions that American intelligence cannot reliably predict. The clock that matters most is not running in Tehran. It is running in Washington, in Jerusalem, in Riyadh, in every capital whose security depends on understanding what Iran is about to do. And that clock is approaching the moment when consequential decisions will be required without the information that has historically guided such decisions. The window for diplomatic intervention is narrowing by the hour. The window for military preemption, if it ever existed, is closing. The window for accurate assessment of what is actually happening inside the IRGC may have already closed. What remains is improvisation. And improvisation in matters involving ballistic missiles, drone swarms, proxy networks, and nuclear-capable infrastructure is the precise category of decision-making that has historically produced catastrophic outcomes. The answer to what comes next is being decided right now, in rooms that no Western intelligence service can reliably penetrate, in conversations between officers whose names appear nowhere in public reporting, in calculations that mix institutional survival with personal ambition with ideological conviction in proportions that nobody outside those rooms can accurately weight. Hossein Salami may be a figurehead by the end of the month. Esmail Khani may have consolidated power that no Quds Force commander has ever possessed. Mojtaba Khamenei may emerge as a transitional figure whose religious legitimacy provides cover for IRGC restructuring. Pezeshkian may discover that his window of opportunity was an illusion that closed before he recognized it had opened. Or none of these scenarios may materialize, replaced by a development that nobody has yet considered. What remains certain is that the architecture that has structured Iran for 46 years has become operationally unstable in ways that have no precedent and no clear resolution. The apparatus is moving. The clerics are responding. The civilian leadership is calculating. The foreign powers are improvising. And somewhere inside the Iranian command structure, decisions are being made that will determine the security environment of the entire region for the next decade. The world is watching what it cannot actually see. The clock is running on a deadline that nobody has yet identified. And the men who will decide what happens next are operating from a calculation that the rest of the world has not yet learned how to read. What unfolds over the coming days will reshape every assumption that has structured Middle Eastern policy since the Iran-Iraq War ended in 1988. The next chapter has not yet been written, but the architecture that will produce it has already been built. And the consequences of what was just constructed will track through every subsequent development in ways that nobody in any capital is yet prepared to confront.